Hello everyone, this is Here's Trivia, and today we're continuing the third rebellion of Huainan Let's Talk Lore series with episode 3, titled The Siege of Shouchun. Before we get started, here's the answer to our trivia question from the end of our last episode, and be sure to stay tuned until the end of this episode for a brand new trivia question. Now last time we ended as we went over the strength of Zhuge forces at Shouchun, as well as the strength of the first wave of the Wu reinforcements. And today we're going to take a look at Sima Zhao's response as news of Zhuge rebellion soon made its way back to the capital. For Sima Zhao and his inner circle, this was the expected and desired outcome of the Grand Excellency promotion. Naturally, it would have been best if Zhuge just accepted the promotion, but with no reason to expect him to just surrender his life away, forcing Zhuge to rebel in a manner where he voluntarily defects to Wu and thus making himself a traitor to the kingdom of Wei is probably the best realistic outcome that Sima Zhao could have hoped for. The concern here was never about whether Zhuge would rebel or not, but rather if his rebellion would spark other Wei loyalists or even ambitious neutral parties to join in opposition of Sima Zhao, who hasn't had the time to establish himself at court after the sudden death of his older brother, Sima Shi. And this lack of firm control of the imperial court is also precisely why Sima Zhao would request the Wei Emperor Cao Mao and Empress Dowager Guo to both accompany him with the army against Zhuge. Because Sima Zhao's biggest fear was not Zhuge army at Shouchun, but rather an internal political coup against him while he was away from the capital. And learning from the lessons of Cao Shuang's failure during his father Sima Yi's coup at Gaopingling, the cautious Sima Zhao would bring both the emperor and the empress dowager with him, as the empress dowager's seal still had great political influence during this period, especially when Emperor Cao Mao was essentially adopted son. Now, as the emperor was going to be in the army, the Wei response had to be grand, and Sima Zhao's plan was to summon not only the forces from the nearby Qing, Xu, Yan, Yu, and Jin provinces, but also even the Wei Western forces, as on paper, the Wei army claimed to total around 500,000 men. This figure was probably correct in terms of actual headcount, but not all 500,000 troops were fighting forces, as more than half would simply be conscripted laborers in charge of logistics and supplies, but that still leaves the Wei army with probably a little under 250,000 combat troops. And given the sheer size of the mobilization, it took Sima Zhao a little under 2 months to finally mobilize against Shouchun, as Zhuge killed Yue Chen on May 1st, 257, and the Wei Imperial Army finally left Luoyang on July 1st. Now, the regional garrison forces, especially those close to the Yang province, could have mobilized a bit earlier, but Sima Zhao's initial command asked those forces to wait in place defensively until the central army arrives north of the Huai River. One of the closest Wei forces would be the Yu province garrison under the command of Wang Ji, who was both the prefect of the Yu province in charge of its civil affairs and the general who stabilizes the east in charge of the provincial garrison troops. In the early period, Wang Ji repeatedly wrote to Sima Zhao requesting to mobilize early, as he wanted to encircle Shouchun before the Wu reinforcement would arrive. But worried about the strength of Zhuge army inside Shouchun itself, Sima Zhao decided against this. And thus on July 5th, before Wang Ji could complete his encirclement of Shouchun, the first Wu reinforcement army, commanded by generals such as Quan Yi and Quan Duan, used the cover of Mount Bagong to the east of the city to slip inside, as now with 30,000 troops from Wu, the strength of Zhuge forces inside Shouchun now numbered close to 180,000. Now, this was not at all Wang Ji's fault, as not only was he delayed in his arrival due to the decisions made by the high command, But his Yu province forces were also not in charge of the northeastern side of the encirclement, as that was tasked to the Qing and Yan province forces. From the Qing province forces, General Li Guang cowardly retreated his army instead of engaging the Wu reinforcement, while from the Yan province forces, Administrator Chang Shi from the Taishan commandery was entirely absent, as he claimed that he was too ill to muster his commandery garrison forces to attend the battle. Both would be promptly executed by Sima Zhao, as war was also a great time to identify both capabilities and loyalties. And in their place, Sima Zhao naturally appointed officers that he trusted, such as Hu Lie, who was the son of the late General Hu Zun, who had just passed away a year prior to natural causes. For those who don't remember, Hu Zun was a Sima clan loyalist that had rose up the military ranks from the Wei Western forces from the days when Sima Yi was garrisoned out west. And naturally his son, Hu Lie, was also a Sima clan loyalist, which is why he would become the new administrator of Taishan Commandery after Changshi was executed. Despite Wu's successful initial reinforcement of Shouchun, Sima Zhao and the rest of the Wei army still would manage to completely encircle the city and put it under siege by August of 257. And for the most part, this was the outcome that both sides wanted. Sima Zhao naturally wanted to contain Zhuge Dan's rebellion to just the city limits of Shouchun. Zhuge Dan, on the other hand, was trying to plot with nature to turn the siege of Shouchun into a trap that would allow him to successfully counterattack. As you see, Zhuge Dan, who had spent years in the Yang province, knew that the rainy season for Shouchun and the Huai River was midsummer to early fall, and in years with heavy rainfall, the Huai River would always flood. So, with Sima Zhao's massive army encamped outside of Shouchun and all around the Huai River, Zhuge Dan was content holding defensively inside the city, as he was waiting for the heavens to literally punish Sima Zhao. And once the rain comes, the opportunity would present itself for a successful counterattack. So, for the early period of Zhuge Dan's rebellion, there were no attempts to break the Wei encirclement, despite both sides having very similar troop count, which usually favors the defense. The only army that was actively trying to break through the encirclement during this period was Wu's second reinforcement army, led by General Zhu Yi. Now, Zhu Yi's army was arriving from the city of Xiakou, farther out to the southwest, because he had been sent there by the Wu regent Sun Chen to put down the previous garrison commander of Xiakou in Sun Yi, because Sun Yi's two brother-in-laws in Teng Yin and Lu Ju had fought a short civil war against Sun Chen over the position of the Wu regency. Sun Yi smartly fled to Wei and defected before getting killed, as Zhu Yi was then instructed to turn his army of roughly 30,000 troops north to attack the Wei encirclement at Shouchun as the second reinforcement army from the kingdom of Wu. Zhu Yi would leave Xiakou around late June, and by late July, early August, Zhu Yi would arrive on the outskirts of Shouchun at a place called Anfeng. Now, at the time, because both sides were quite content with the outcome of the siege, there was not a concerted effort by Zhuge Dan and the defenders inside the city of Shouchun to coordinate a sally-out attack in conjunction with Zhu Yi's assault. The only force that was spared was a small cavalry detachment commanded by Wen Qing, which did very little. For the Wei side, the prefect of the Yan province, Zhou Tai, was tasked with deterring Zhu Yi's assault, as the two armies would clash at a place called Yangxian, where Zhou Tai successfully beat back Zhu Yi's initial attack, and during Zhu Yi's retreat, Zhou Tai was able to give pursuit and deal roughly 2,000 casualties to the Wu side. Despite this early defeat, the Wu regent, Sun Chen, continued to pressure Zhu Yi to attack, as by this time, Sun Chen himself had arrived in the Yang province as a third Wu reinforcement army, led by himself, and was now situated at their military forts at Dongxing Dam, directly south of Shouchun. And to bolster Zhu Yi's battered army, Generals Ding Feng and Li Fei, along with 20,000 fresh troops, were sent to Zhu Yi's encampment at Lijiang. But at the same time, unbeknownst to the Wu forces, more Wei troops were now closing in on Zhu Yi's position, as General Shi Bao, the commander of the Qing province garrison forces, had now joined forces with Zhou Tai's Yan province forces directly north of Zhu Yi's encampment, as the two sides were separated by just a river. And thus, when Zhu Yi resumed his attack by sending out a vanguard force of 6,000 troops to establish the floating bridges necessary for the rest of the army to cross into Wei-controlled territory to reach Shouchun, this detachment came under heavy fire and was soon beaten back as the Wei forces pushed slowly across the river, threatening Zhu Yi's main camp directly. Zhu Yi immediately retreated his army to higher ground and attempted to create a defensive position by forming a ring of siege carts to deter any cavalry charges by the Wei forces, but Zhu Yi's efforts could not turn the tide of the battle, as the Wei side enjoyed the advantages of having more troops, having better armor, and just having overall more seasoned troops, especially coming off of the heels of Guan Qiujian's rebellion, as Zhu Yi's army would be overwhelmed and forced to flee south. To make matters worse, Zhu Yi had previously put his supplies on the opposite side of the lake from his encampment to ensure their safety, but somehow the Wei forces snuffed out their location, as Hu Lie's Taishan commandery forces, numbering roughly 5,000 troops, raided Zhu Yi's supply depot at Dulu, burning away all of Zhu Yi's food and supplies. And by the time Zhu Yi's army finally escaped to a safe position closer to Sun Chen's garrison at Dongxing, the army was boiling arrowroot and tree leaves for sustenance. Yet despite this, Sun Chen still wanted to give Zhu Yi command of 30,000 more troops to resume the attack, as Sun Chen was also facing political pressure from the Wu court to rescue the now entrapped Wu reinforcement inside Shouchun. However, this time, Zhu Yi refused, as his army was simply in no shape to continue to fight. Frustrated at Zhu Yi, Sun Chen summoned Zhu Yi to meet in person with the intentions of executing him as a scapegoat for this seemingly failed campaign, as Sun Chen now desperately wanted to return back to Jianye, as the child emperor Sun Liang had started to self-rule in his absence, effectively voiding his regent status. Now, Zhu Yi was oblivious to all this, as he thought of Sun Chen as family, even though his own officer, Lu Kang, the son of Lu Xun, tried to warn him beforehand. And once he arrived at Sun Chen's camp, Sun Chen immediately ordered his guards to seize Zhu Yi and strangle him before even giving him a chance to defend himself. And thus, with Zhu Yi's death, the command of Zhu Yi's army would be handed over to Sun Chen's brother, Sun En, while Sun Chen would immediately return back to Jianye to deal with political matters back at home, effectively giving up on aiding Zhuge Dan's rebellion. And with the Wu exit, we're going to be ending our episode here as well, as we'll return tomorrow to discuss the conclusion of the siege of Shouchun. So hopefully you all have enjoyed this episode enough to consider subscribing to the channel for more content on Three Kingdoms history, or simply support the channel by leaving a comment below, or just by hitting the like button. And as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye!